Suspect is in custody. Call the prison and let him know he's coming home. Over.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Just been having a blast with BeamNG and even the new CarX Street game using the steering wheel. I've got a pretty ghetto setup, but it's good enough for now. Outside of that, I've been diversifying between, using a controller, a mouse and keyboard, sometimes the VR, playing shooters or RPGs, Souls-likes, and racing games recently that have returned my childhood once again, as well as my enthusiasm for cars. The nostalgic sweet spot when it comes to gaming for me was in the 2000s period, more specifically in the arcade racing genre, when it was in its prime in my opinion, and each franchise had their own identity, world, and handling model as well as physics. Some people's nostalgic period goes even further than that though, from the 90s and even further back into the 80s, and it goes beyond just games. The indie space has explored both decades in the form of pixel-based games from the late 80s and early 90s to the low-poly PS1-centric era that we see in the late 90s. The game that I'm going to talk about in this video is a mix of both late 80s and early 90s blended together in one of the most unique and aesthetically beautiful arcade races I've seen so far, and it's a game called Slipstream. Slipstream is a combination of games like Horizon Chase and most notably Outrun. Both series had fast cars on a highway road where you would drift your way throughout the stage, trying desperately not to hit a wall or a car or literally anything else. It's the exact opposite of what you would see in today's arcade racing scene like in The Crew, Forza Horizon, or Need for Speed, where it's a mix of both realistic driving and arcade handling. Some would even call it a simcade or sim arcade. But Slipstream is a far more exaggerated and arcade-like experience in comparison. It was also a mirror of a time when racing games would go for more of a 2.5D display or a pseudo 3D approach in the game's development. This was also before we would start getting low poly racing games that would give us a fully 3D environment to race in. One notable example being Gran Turismo that would push the limits of the PS1 at the time. Slipstream goes for the pseudo 3D approach using Java and libGDX when it was originally developed and eventually rewritten in F&A. Slipstream was designed to be a love letter to a far older era of the arcade racing scene, the scene that existed before people like me started glazing Need for Speed Most Wanted. This game has the 80s and 90s retro aesthetic written all over it, through the designs of the cars, the locations, the music, even to the designs of the many rivals that you'll race throughout Slipstream. Like Outrun, you'll go through a myriad of different highways across various locations, maintaining a high sense of speed and drifting around the corners. You put your name in and you're given a menu that gives you a number of activities to partake in, but the most important one will be the tutorial that introduces you to the basic controls and mechanics of this game. The two most important things to take note of in the driving is the drifting and the slipstream mechanic. With drifting, it'll be the essential component to mastering each of the turns, and how well you align your car before you make the turn will also make the difference between completing the drift or crashing into something and losing significant progress. The second component is slipstreaming, which gives your car a big boost when you're behind a car for long enough. Those that have played through Midnight Club 2 or 3 or Los Angeles will have a similar idea to how this works. But in this game, it's indicated by the letter on the bottom right, which will form as you continue slipstreaming, and then when you get the full letter, you will then get a speed effect like you're going into hyperspace or something, and this is great for boosting. Once you have those two mechanics nailed down, the rest is relatively easy. The controls themselves aren't too complicated here, you just accelerate, brake, and steer. With drifting, you tap the brake to initiate a drift, and the rest will be up to you on how to control it. You have two options for the drift mode, manual or automatic. Automatic gives you a much more simpler form of drifting where you don't have to worry about the turn too much, but on manual you have a lot more control over the angles of your drift. For the most complete form of the drifting system, and in my opinion the best experience, I would recommend using manual, and it's not as difficult as you would think it would be either. Slipstream in terms of difficulty is sometimes easy and sometimes is hard. It can be easy because there's not really that much to the racing itself once you nail it down. No matter what track you do, you're always going at a high speed and drifting around the corners, and as long as you can consistently maintain speed and dodge traffic like raindrops, you'll generally win the races that the game has to offer. Where it becomes hard is when you start making mistakes. The rivals and general opponents may be prone to making mistakes and crashing, but if it's you doing it and them acing the road, it's then near impossible to catch up sometimes, especially when you set the vehicles to heavy, which is kind of like this game's version of hard mode. The game doesn't really have a story, but it does have a unique setting of its own that stands out from other indie races or racing games in general. When you think about it, there are very few racing games that bed themselves in the late 80s or early 90s. In fact, it would be pretty awesome to see a modern racing game set itself in a much older time period, like this game does. But Slipstream is close enough in its pixelated retro form. The cars themselves are reflective of those two time periods, and they also have their differences in handling. Some cars can accelerate better, handle better, or have better top speed, but for me personally, the biggest difference has mainly been in the way the cars handle, because generally speaking, the acceleration at top speed eventually evens out anyways due to the circumstances within the highway roads, like the traffic and the cornering that takes place. I love the designs of these cars. The pixel work and the frame transitions are fantastic, and I can tell that it took a fairly long time to get everything right between each frame of the cars themselves. For cars that technically aren't 3D, they transition really well between turns, coupled with the game's great sense of speed, something that earlier retro games did in some ways better than modern racing games do, making you feel like you were really going at the speed of light. While it would have been cool to see more cars and have more color choices or some more customization options, I understand that it would have taken more work, and when it's just the one person making a game that took years to finalize, we're lucky that we even have a final product at all. As excited as I am for games like Night Runners, it's still a dream that hasn't come true yet, even with the existence of the prologue that's available to play. However, Slipstream is finished and can be played on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo, and it was done by a Brazilian developer who struggled with the traditional educational system and still managed to make a game like this through hard work and dedication. And that hard work and dedication gave us 20 amazing looking maps to drive in, a handful number of great looking rides to play in, and a variety of modes to boot, like the Grand Tour, Single Race, Time Trial, Grand Prix, Cannonball, and Battle Royale. The Grand Tour has you going through multiple stages and racing rivals, and there are a good number of them too. Each rival has their own distinct personality and appearance, and the encounters are generally random. Sometimes you'll win and sometimes you'll lose, but as you improve at the game, you'll generally be able to handle them fairly easily, as long as you don't crash, and when you complete a stage and win, you get to read their coping and seething on screen. In Grand Tour, after a stage is completed, you have two routes. Taking one will commit you to that stage, and it's basically the same process until you complete the tour. Replaying the Grand Tour gives you chances to do different routes, so there is quite a bit of replayability to be had in this mode. Single Race and Time Trial are what they are. Single races let you pick a map with opponents, as well as the number of laps as well. Time Trial is a good way to practice the layout of each stage, as well as mastering the turns and getting the fastest time. Grand Prix is a tournament-based mode where you have two options: stock for preset builds, and custom, where you can earn money to further upgrade the performance of your ride. There are 4 cups, and if you're doing the custom mode, you'll want to know the strengths and weaknesses of your car before you commit to upgrading a specific part. Also, the difficulties consist of light, medium, and heavy. They affect how well your car handles, and the same is true for your opponents. Light is very easy, even when you screw up and make mistakes. Medium is somewhere in between, and certain mistakes can still cost you. On heavy, cars can catch up to you fairly easily, and if you screw up and crash, you're usually done for. But there is one thing I forgot to mention, and it's the rewind mechanic. Basically, when you fuck up, you have a chance to unfuck yourself by going back in time, 5 seconds precisely before the mistake had occurred. You can stop it prematurely or go to the very last second, but it is there as an option to basically be a lifesaver at crucial moments that can mean the difference between winning or losing. But it's not a system you can abuse frequently, because there is usually a cooldown right after you use it before it can be used again, so keep this stuff in mind when you do the Grand Prix, as well as all of the other events. Cannonball is sort of similar to Grand Tour, but you race opponents and rivals if you have them turned on across multiple tracks. And the difference here between the two is that you can actually shuffle through the tracks, as well as the amount of tracks that you can do. You can make it quick or go through every single map for a gauntlet, and it can be a fun experience. Then finally, there's the Battle Royale mode where you race rivals and the last opponent in the ongoing stage gets knocked out at the end. Cannonball is probably my favorite because it essentially provides a similar experience to Grand Tour, but you can play more tracks if you want to, as well as how many opponents you want in that stage. And if you hate traffic that much, you can also change that too with the traffic density. The modes in general are pretty fun and progression is easy to track since you can go to the main menu and see what you have and haven't done yet, as well as checking out your trophies, which is also a neat feature and doesn't really take that long to fill up. Slipstream was a game in the past that I tried, and unfortunately, at that time, it just didn't click for me, even though I really wanted to like it. But after some humility from doing the Midnight Club games and going through some shitty losses, I've disciplined myself to just accept the outcomes of races, which made it a lot easier for me to give Slipstream a second chance because even this game can have some frustrating moments, like a lot of other racing games, or just any game in general. Slipstream is a game that I can now recommend to anyone that's looking for old school racing games with a more retro aesthetic, with a beautiful variety of maps, a pretty baller soundtrack where the electronic vibes will stroke the listener's 80s fetish, great car designs, fun handling, and a great sense of speed. All of this just nicely wrapped into a retro package. It's also got some other bells and whistles like a workshop that hasn't been explored enough, graphical filters for a more retro look, which is just more extra sauce on a delicious meal that is this game. And fans of arcade races will have their appetites satiated with this gem. I'm hoping that the developer one day makes another racing game within the same time period, but further expanded, or even take the same gameplay, improve it, and put it into a Japanese expressway-like setting. Seriously, put these two games together and you'll have something pretty fucking cool in my opinion. In any event, Slipstream is a great arcade racer that's worth your time. Thanks for watching.